Welcome to our course, Green Economy from China's Stories. Today, we are going to focus on environmental policy assessment by the table of contents below. First, the environmental policy assessment standards. Second, the types of environmental policies and practices. In this chapter, we will talk about 4 types of environmental policies: the command and control environmental policy, the market-intensive environmental policy, the public supervision environmental policy, and the voluntary environmental policy. Finally, we will study a specific environmental policy case. Now, let's turn into the first part, the environmental policy assessment standards. What kind of environmental policy is a good one? How do we assess an environmental policy? In fact, environmental economists usually assess an environmental policy from the following 5 aspects: efficiency, cost effectiveness, fairness, incentives for technological improvements, and enforceability. Now, let's explain these 5 aspects one by one. The first assessment standard is efficiency. Actually, the governance efficiency of an environmental policy shares the basic same meaning of efficiency in microeconomics. Let's review the concept of optimal in microeconomics. The efficiency in microeconomics refers to the optimal decision when both consumers and producers have an optimal decision, and they will not change their decision. Then the market will be in the equilibrium point. That is, the quantity of products that consumers are willing to buy is the same quantity the producers are willing to produce. Then they will be in a balance. Similarity, the governance efficiency of environmental policy means policy governance will cause emission reduction cost and eliminate environmental damage at the same time, and there must be a balance point between them. So which point is the balance point? Look at the picture on the right. In this picture, the horizontal axis represents the emission reduction cost, and the vertical axis represents the environmental loss, with the implementation strength of an environmental policy increasing. The emission reduction cost will get higher, of course, at the same time. So which one is the balance point? The balance point should be their cross point, namely the equilibrium point. It is the most efficient point. When we implement an environmental policy, we should make sure that the strength point is at the efficient point. At this time, the environmental policy is the most efficient. The second assessment standard for environmental policy is cost effectiveness. Cost effectiveness and efficiency sound similar, but they are different concepts. The efficiency we just mentioned involves one policy. There is a balance point for its implementation strength, while the cost effectiveness involves multiple choices, and the optimal cost effective policy should be decided from different policies. Specifically, if a policy produces the maximum environmental improvement possible for the resources being expended, or equivalently, it achieves a given amount of environmental improvement at least possible cost, then it is a cost-effective policy. compared with other policies. This is for different environmental policies. If there are several environmental policies, we should choose the most cost-effective one. The third standard is fairness. Is the environmental policy fair? Fairness is first and foremost a matter for morality and the concerns about how the benefits and costs of environmental improvements ought to be distributed among members of the whole society. Why is there an issue of fairness in environmental policies? First of all, the environmental pollution has eternity if there is no environmental policy. The polluting enterprise may not make up for the pollution caused by it. At this time, other enterprises and residents may suffer losses. When implementing environmental policies, we need to consider how to eliminate the externality, that is, how do we solve the issue of fairness? Generally speaking, the principle of environmental policy is making the cause of pollution responsible for treating it, and the distribution of environmental governance benefits should also be considered at the same time. For example, A, B, C, and D in the figure on the left represent 4 environmental policies. Each environmental policy has costs and produces benefits. The costs of 4 policies shown in the figure are the same, but their total benefits are different. The total benefits of A and B is lower than that C and D. Therefore, we can exclude A and B as the optimal environmental policy. But for C and D, their total costs and total benefits are the same, so C or D, which one is better? At this time, we should not only consider the total benefits and the net benefits produced by these 2 policies, but also the distribution of the net benefits among different groups of the people, Group X and Group Y, represented different income groups. Group X represents low-income groups, and Group Y represents high-income groups. From the figure, we can see that in Project C, the low-income Group X shares 20 of net benefits, and Group Y gets 70. But the gap between Group X and Group Y in Project D is not so big. One gets 40 and the other gets 50. So when considering the fair distribution of benefits among different income groups, we should choose D. The fourth standard for assessing an environmental policy is incentives for technological improvements. When we assess any environmental policy, an extremely important standard that we must use is whether the environmental policy provides a strong incentive for individuals and groups to find new innovative ways to reduce their impact on the surrounding environment. An environmental policy should stimulate the technological process of enterprises. This is the ultimate goal of the policy. According to Porter's theory, an environmental policy should promote technology. The fifth environmental policy assessment standard is enforceability. Policies should be enforceable. Many students may not have considered enforceability of a policy and think that it must be implemented as long as it is formulated. But in fact, the implementation of a policy takes time and requires other resources, such as human power and funds, but public financial expenditure is limited, and sometimes there are conflicts between the expenditures on environmental policies and the expenditure of other projects. how to balance these conflicts. Therefore, how do we formulate a scientific and reasonable policies? And how do we measure the effect of implementation of a policy? How do we conduct supervision and punishment for violations of the enforceability principle? These issues must be considered before policies are made out. Only in this way can the policies formulated be enforceable. The 5 environmental policy assessment standards, namely efficiency, cost effectiveness, fairness, incentives for technological improvements, and enforceability, none of them is dispensable. An environmental policy meeting these standards is a good environmental policy. Well, we are done about the introduction to environmental policy assessment standards. Thank you. See you next time.